So much for talking to me, Dr. Moyo. I've been looking forward to engaging with you. So let's start with the most recent, of course, in terms of developments, that explosion in Bulawayo. How significant an event is it in terms of the trajectory to free and fair elections that many people are looking forward to?
It is very significant, but Thulasizwe, my view is that we need to do a diagnostic as to where our societies are and how we got to be there. So whilst we clearly applaud President Mnangagwa's attempt at preaching peace and security and peaceful elections and so on, we ought to also take account of how it is that our societies are so violent in nature and very unaccommodating. There is a lot of abuse, even verbally. When you debate, things are not debated properly. And this is a manifestation of what has been happening in the last 38 years. And I think we need to recognize that. Whilst we applaud him on the one side about what he's trying to do, I think he is part of ZANU. You have to take responsibility for essentially making our society a very intolerant society, not democratic, because they are suppressing other people's voices. And this is the product of what has been going on.
I know that, it's being investigated by the police and, you are no investigator. But what is your thinking around who could it be? I mean, who's potentially behind this? President Mnangagwa says this came from my usual enemies and says it came from outside Bulawayo. And I was saying a few days ago that that's also significant for him to actually say that about the city itself and, knowing the dynamics in Zimbabwe.
Yeah. My personal inclination is not to speculate, because I think when we speculate, we probably create more problems than we solve. So my view would be, let the experts do their work, and then let's deal with facts when they come out, as opposed to us creating all sorts of other speculative assumptions about who did what, because I don't think that will help us. Yeah. So let's give time for those who know what they're doing to find out exactly what the facts behind this are, and then let's deal with that when we get to know.
So you do point that, the incidents like this one point to a system that crept in over a period of some 38 years of ZANU-PF rule. You were previously in the government, led by former President Robert Mugabe. You left in 2001, and then President Mugabe described you as a coward. Yeah. Just how do you, in terms of your proposals now, how do you weigh your chances of being received by the people of Zimbabwe and that reception being expressed at the ballot box on the 30th of July?
If I go back to when we started campaigning and where we are now, a huge shift has taken place because we are trying to campaign and do politics very differently. So clearly, people were, when they started to say, what is this? They couldn't recognize what we're doing. For instance, we don't hold rallies. We don't buy people T-shirts. We refuse to buy votes, essentially, but we engage in a very respectful way to explain why we don't do that. And I think people are warming up to what we're doing and how we're doing it, especially after the launch of our manifesto. They've looked at it and found it to be so different, challenging but different, and people are beginning to engage to say, you know what? I think what is being proposed here could actually work. So I think we're making a lot of progress, and by the time the elections happen, my view is that the result is going to be anything other than what people expect.
In fact, I was reading your manifesto. It emphasizes issues to do, for instance, with the issue of unity and cohesion and then working together. Meritocracy is one of the things that you put forward in terms of being the basis for the formation of the government and the civil service. Yeah. Can Zimbabwe be turned around in the way that you describe in your manifesto, given how deeply rooted the problems have become over the decades?
Oh, absolutely. If the answer to be no, then that would be a bit of a worry, wouldn't it?
But where do you start?
As a manager, I've got absolutely no doubt that we can do this. The starting point is to do a diagnosis, to see where we are, but to understand how we got here. We are where we are for very clear reasons in terms of our own behaviors. So I think an introspective approach rather than blaming other people is a good starting point. Let's look at things that we can control, things that we're responsible for. Corruption is something that we did, and we can control it. Lack of meritocracy, or the opposite of nepotism, cronyism, and the patronage, is something we did, not anybody else. We can control it. Lack of introspection In other words, not looking at what we have done and always pointing fingers at other people. It's something we can do. If we resolve those three things, Zimbabwe will turn around.
Let me ask you a question that I know that will is probably a bit sensitive. The subtle sort of tribal dynamics that are there in Zimbabwe that not many will acknowledge publicly, but almost everyone subtly accepts that they are there. Can Zimbabwe elect, for instance, a president who is not of Shona descent, who is a Ndebele man?
But it depends on what the context of your question is, because I'm not Ndebele.
Okay, you're not Ndebele.
No, I'm not.
See, I'm exposed for my assumptions.
My mother is Ndebele.
Okay, so do address that issue, though. I mean, we were talking a bit earlier on about the incident happening in Bulawayo, but also you also emphasize the need for what you call restorative justice for historical injustices, including the atrocities in the early 80s in Matabeleland.
Yeah, but both South Africa and Zimbabwe are not new to this. So in Zimbabwe at independence, we could have said, Ian Smith killed our people and we're going to go after him. We didn't do that. Similarly, here in South Africa, in 1994, you could have done exactly the same, given the atrocities that had taken place on very tribally based, racially based lines. But you didn't do that either. So for us, as a people in Southern Africa, this is nothing new. We've done it before, we can do it again.
Would there need to be prosecutions for people who were involved in those atrocities?
My view is that we need to be quite careful about not trying to reconstruct a past which we cannot do. People's lives were lost. You cannot bring them back. But I think a conversation has to happen. And the victims and the families of victims have to be given a voice. They have to be able to tell their story, and they have to be able to put on the table their own views on what they think should be done. And we need to then engage with that. If we follow that kind of process, I think we'll end up in a very good place where we can build a future where those things cannot happen again.
Dr. Nkosana Moyo, we're totally out of time. I would have loved to continue this conversation, but it's the first of many conversations as we build up to the July the 30th elections in Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for coming through and having this conversation with me here on ENCA.